November 2nd, 1944, the Philippine Sea boiled with thunder. Rain lashed against the decks of Liberty's ships crawling through the straits toward Leyte. The night sky glowed in pulses of orange from distant gunfire. Beneath the waves, Japanese submarines prowled, their captains straining to catch the silhouettes of fat, slow American supply ships. Yet again and again, their scopes found something impossible. Columns of gray-hulled escorts flanking every freighter like an armored wall, guns pointed outward, radar dishes spinning. Searchlights swept across the black water. Aircraft droned overhead even at midnight, their engine notes rising like mechanical hymns. It was a convoy unlike anything Japan's navy had imagined, a moving fortress at sea, awake in darkness. From the bridges of Japanese destroyers, officers whispered disbelief. By doctrine and tradition, night was the time of the Imperial Navy. Their torpedo tactics were honed for stealth under moonlight. American convoys should have been easy prey, yet the targets glowed with radar-guided precision, layered screens of escorts weaving in tight choreography. Ammunition ships, oilers, and troop carriers slid forward with unbroken rhythm, as if guided by some unseen hand. Even in storm squalls, the formation held, iron straight lines across the heaving Pacific. Every Japanese commander felt the same unease. This was not simply a convoy. This was an organism, living and alert, immune to surprise on the freighters themselves. Young American sailors hauled crates of rations, artillery shells, and aviation fuel under shielded lights, moving in an eerie, methodical ballet. The crews knew the risk, torpedo wakes and sudden air attacks, but they also knew their escorts never slept. Fletcher-class destroyers cut swathes through the swells, their sonar teams hunting silently, their 5-inch guns cocked for instant fire. Above, Navy Avengers and Wildcats orbited like predators, relaying sightings back to the convoy screen. Even at 2 a.m., the sky shimmered with the faint glow of radar scopes. For the first time in naval warfare, darkness had lost its teeth. In Tokyo, intelligence reports were fragmented and troubling. Japanese cryptographers intercepted American transmissions, but could not decode their brevity or their patterns. How could convoys coordinate with such precision at night? How were they anticipating submarine ambushes before torpedoes left their tubes? On maps in smoky war rooms, red pins marked failed attacks. Crews reported being driven off by destroyers that seemed to know exactly where they lurked. The old assumption that the United States was clumsy at night operations was crumbling like salt spray on steel. Hours before dawn on that November morning, one Japanese subcommander, Lieutenant Commander Hiroshi Kudo, rose to periscope depth. Ahead lay a train of freighters, silhouetted in dim starlight. He lined up a perfect shot, but as his torpedoes left their tubes, a destroyer suddenly veered toward his bearing, depth charges already rolling off its stern. Explosions racked the submarine, tearing through bulkheads. Kudo's men, trained to strike from shadows, could not understand how the Americans had found them. As the submarine broke apart under pressure, he glimpsed, through his last periscope sweep, the improbable, a convoy under full escort at night, planes overhead, and radar pips glowing like eyes in the dark, thousands of miles away. In Washington and Pearl Harbor, planners understood exactly what they were doing. This was not luck. It was a system born of desperation and innovation. The Pacific theater's distances were punishing. Troops on the beaches of Leyte and beyond could not fight without endless rivers of supplies. Every bullet, every ration, and every gallon of fuel had to cross submarine-infested seas. Convoys had to survive, or the invasion would starve. America's answer was total integration, radar on every escort, radio networks tying ship to ship, and a doctrine that erased the boundary between day and night. WWII Autumn 1944. The United States Navy had built a machine the Imperial Navy had never faced. Hunter-killer groups roaming ahead off convoys and destroyer escorts bristling with sonar, hedgehog mortars, and radar-directed gunnery. Merchant ships were armed with Navy gun crews. Escort carriers provided constant air cover. Even the newest Japanese Type 95 torpedoes could barely slip through the screens. What began as desperate improvisation in 1942 had matured into a seamless convoy system, a moving bastion of steel and electronics. Immune to surprise attacks that had once shattered Allied shipping in the Atlantic and Pacific alike on the decks of Japanese destroyers shadowing the American armadas, veterans compared notes in hushed tones. They had survived Midway, the Solomons, and countless night duels. Yet what they now faced felt alien. Radar beams pierced the squall lines. Destroyers accelerated with uncanny timing, as if guided by an invisible script. American merchant sailors, once easy targets, moved unhurried, even cocky, under cover of the escorts. Convoys were no longer just logistical lines. They were weapons in themselves, grinding down submarines and tying up Japan's few remaining destroyers in futile chases. As the first light of dawn touched the horizon, the illusion of night dominance vanished completely. American planes launched from escort carriers, wings gleaming in the rising sun, engines howling. They fanned out over the ocean like hawks, strafing any contact, herding submarines into deeper water. Below decks, radar operators updated screens with measured calm, plotting every friendly and enemy blip. Messages flashed in coded bursts between ships, their frequencies hopping in patterns Japan could not follow. Convoys surged on toward Leyte, unbroken. Even in defeat, Japanese officers could not look away. They sketched the formations, counted the escorts, and traced radar antennas with binoculars. The image burned into their minds, the end of the night as a weapon. America had achieved something unprecedented, the ability to project protection over hundreds of miles of ocean, day and night, through coordinated layers of ships, aircraft, and electronics. It was not just the number of ships, but the doctrine, the choreography, and the relentless vigilance. And so, on that November night and countless nights after, Japanese submariners stared through their periscopes and wondered at the convoys that never slept. The war at sea had turned upside down. The hunter had become the hunted. The darkness, once their ally, had been stolen by a navy that could see through storms and strike in the dead of night. In the black waters of the Philippine Sea, a new kind of warfare unfolded, one built on connection, constant watchfulness, and the cold hum of radar in the dark. WWII late 1944. The war in the Pacific had reached a brutal crescendo. The tide that had once favored Japan was now an undertow, pulling its empire apart. American forces, bloodied but relentless, pressed closer to the Japanese homeland with each island seized. The Philippines, once a proud jewel of Japan's southern conquests, had become a battlefield of attrition. To support this massive operation, the United States faced a challenge unprecedented in naval history, sustaining a full-scale invasion force across thousands of miles of hostile ocean. At the center of this effort lay the convoys, long, gray lifelines stretching from Hawaii to Ulithi and from New Guinea to Leyte Gulf, each carrying food, ammunition, fuel, and replacements. Without them, the island-hopping strategy would wither. The Imperial Japanese Navy had built its doctrine on decisive battles and swift night strikes. For decades, it trained to annihilate enemy fleets in one thunderclap engagement, a replay of Tsushima writ large. Its submarines were not commerce raiders, but fleet scouts, designed to weaken American warships before the climactic duel. This doctrine left Japan ill-prepared for the grinding convoy war America now waged. The Pacific's distances punished mistakes. A freighter sunk near Ulithi could starve soldiers on Leyte days later. Japanese strategists clung to their night torpedo tactics, confident that darkness and speed could offset American numbers. Yet every passing month exposed how outdated that belief had become. By contrast, the United States Navy had absorbed the bitter lessons of the Atlantic. German U-boats had once terrorized Allied shipping from Iceland to Cape Hatteras. Convoy systems, escort carriers, sonar, radar, and code-breaking had slowly turned that tide. Those same tools, refined, mass-produced, and adapted for the Pacific, now crossed the ocean at an industrial scale. Convoys were not mere defensive formations, but moving fortresses, a deliberate, technological counter to Japan's reliance on stealth and surprise. They reflected a strategic shift, rather than seeking one decisive fleet engagement. The United States would strangle Japan by sustaining a continuous, unstoppable flow of men and material until resistance collapsed. Every piece of this machine had been forged by necessity. The United States could pour out Liberty ships from West Coast shipyards faster than Japan could sink them. But numbers alone were not enough. Convoys required coordination, and coordination required vision, both literal and strategic. Radar became the eyes. High-frequency radios became the nervous system. Destroyers and destroyer escorts became the armored skeleton, bristling with anti-submarine weapons. Escort carriers provided the airborne shield. It was a living organism, built to deny the enemy the ocean's oldest advantage: invisibility at night. For Japanese planners in Tokyo, the convoys represented a nightmare they could barely quantify. Submarine commanders sent back garbled reports of radar-equipped destroyers appearing out of storms, of aircraft patrolling at midnight, and of merchantmen sailing with uncanny discipline. Old tactics, once devastating in the Solomons, now failed with humiliating predictability. Night surface attacks broke against walls of gunfire. Torpedoes that had once crippled U.S. carriers now found only alert escorts with sonar arrays sweeping like pendulums. Every failed strike consumed fuel Japan could not replace, wearing down the very submarines it counted on. In Washington and Pearl Harbor, planners watched this attrition with calculated patience. They knew the stakes. Each convoy reaching Leyte meant more fuel for Patton's tanks, more shells for MacArthur's artillery, and more blood plasma for the wounded. The convoys were arteries feeding a giant. Protecting them was not an afterthought, but the very heart of the strategy. The Navy's Bureau of Ships and Bureau of Ordnance poured resources into anti-submarine warfare. The Pacific Fleet rehearsed new escort doctrines until ship captains could maneuver in darkness without a word of speech, their positions choreographed like dancers. This was war as a system, not as a duel. Even within the U.S. Navy, veterans marveled at the transformation. In 1942, convoys had been thinly protected, their escorts scattered and under-equipped. By 1944, they were armored highways of steel. Each merchantman knew its station. Each destroyer's radar sweep overlapped the next. Escort carriers launched fighters and torpedo bombers in unbroken rotations, blanketing hundreds of square miles. Submarines attempting to infiltrate these moving citadels found themselves trapped between converging depth charge patterns. If one ship fell, the network closed the gap instantly, its cohesion unbroken. The psychological effect on Japanese crews was profound. They had grown up on tales of the decisive battle, one lightning strike to cripple the enemy. Instead, they faced a conveyor belt of supplies, endless and immune to terror. The American system reduced their boldest tactics to mere harassment, draining morale with each failed ambush. It was a quiet reversal of power. No longer did American sailors dread the night. Japanese submariners did. This shift was more than tactics. It was industrial and cultural. Japan, with its limited shipbuilding capacity and dwindling fuel reserves, could not match America's conveyor belt of escorts and radar sets. Nor could it train an entire navy to wage a commerce war overnight. Its doctrine, built over decades, ossified even as American innovation accelerated. Thus, the convoys became a symbol of an empire's decline and another's ascendancy, one navy still clinging to heroic night attacks, the other embracing cold, methodical protection of lifelines. AS 1944 drew to a close. The Leyte campaign crystallized this transformation. Amphibious forces needed mountains of ammunition, vehicles, and medical supplies. Convoys had to thread through waters still contested by Japanese submarines and aircraft. Yet, with each successful passage, the American footprint on Philippine soil deepened. The convoys were not glamorous. They did not make headlines like the battles of Midway or the Bismarck Sea, but they were the quiet hammer blows breaking Japan's capacity to fight. In war, logistics is destiny, and the Americans had made logistics untouchable. Night after night, the pattern repeated. Convoys moved. Escorts killed. Supplies flowed. Japanese submarines died. And with each loss, the Imperial Navy's grip on the Pacific slipped further. By the time Japan's admirals realized that convoys were the real battle, not the fleet actions they had dreamed of, it was too late. The Pacific had been rewired into a grid of moving fortresses, each one a testimony to American industrial power, electronic vision, and doctrinal flexibility. This was the backdrop to those astonishing November nights when Japanese soldiers, sailors, and pilots stared at American convoys protected day and night, unable to comprehend how such a system had been built. It was not just hardware or numbers. It was the convergence of strategy, technology, and willpower into a single relentless force. Against that force, the old weapons of stealth and surprise dissolved like ink in salt water. In the Pacific of 1944, darkness itself had been conquered. What the Japanese sailors and submariners could not yet see in November 1944 was the hidden lattice of innovation pulsing beneath every American convoy. Their periscopes caught only the steel, Liberty ships, destroyer escorts, and escort carriers. But the true advantage was invisible, a nervous system of electronics, doctrine, and constant training that transformed a column of slow freighters into an armored organism. By day, it wore the familiar face of massed power. By night, it became something altogether alien, a fleet that could see in darkness and hear beyond the horizon. This was the secret factor that shattered Japan's assumptions, a fusion of radar, sonar, and coordinated air cover that extended protection into every hour of the 24. The first layer of that advantage was the sky itself. Beginning in 1943, the U.S. Navy deployed tiny escort carriers alongside convoys. Crude compared to fleet carriers, these jeep carriers nonetheless revolutionized convoy protection. Each one carried a squadron of fighters and torpedo bombers, Avengers with radar sets slung under their bellies and Wildcats fitted for night flying. They scoured the ocean far beyond visual range, transmitting bearings to ships below. To Japanese submariners, the sudden roar of engines at night seemed supernatural. Aircraft would swoop out of blackness, depth charges tumbling, forcing subs down before they could even line up an attack. This airborne net extended miles outward, sealing gaps that had once been safe approaches. Beneath the waves, another layer waited. Sonar, refined from the Atlantic War, had been installed on every escort. Teams of operators sat in dimly lit rooms, headphones pressed tight, tracing contacts with grease pencils. They learned to distinguish between whale songs and the hum of propellers, to predict a submarine's turn before it made it. Once a contact was fixed, destroyers could unleash hedgehog mortars, a curtain of explosives set to detonate only on impact, or roll patterns of depth charges that converged like fists around a submerged foe. This constant pressure forced Japanese submarines to travel deeper, slower, and farther from their targets, crippling their ability to stalk convoys. The most mysterious element, however, was the web of high-frequency radios tying everything together. The U.S. Navy's TBS, talk between ships, circuits allowed escorts to share contacts instantly, their transmissions crackling across the formation without revealing themselves to enemy direction finders. This radio discipline, drilled through endless rehearsals, created a convoy that moved as one, like a school of fish turning at the same instant. If a submarine surfaced, a plane sighted it, a destroyer plotted its course, and a message flashed across the network before the enemy even knew it had been spotted. Japanese cryptographers, masters at code-breaking earlier in the war, found only static and brevity in these transmissions, nothing to exploit, nothing to predict. Radar, too, had matured into something Japan could not match. Surface search sets on destroyers swept the ocean in spinning arcs, plotting even the faintest echoes of periscopes or torpedo wakes. Air search radar on escort carriers detected incoming strikes at impossible ranges, allowing fighters to be launched before Japanese planes crossed the horizon. Even the merchant ships themselves bristled with radar antennas, giving watch officers a new sense of space and direction. Darkness, fog, and rain squalls all became irrelevant. The Pacific's vastness shrank into a grid of blips and bearings, every movement tracked and countered. This technological edge was reinforced by doctrine. American convoy commanders no longer relied on intuition or heroic gambles. They applied pre-planned formations, overlapping patrol arcs, and immediate counterattack drills. If one escort detected a contact, others closed the net without waiting for orders. Convoy commodores and carrier captains coordinated by radio in real time, flexing their formations to meet threats. The result was an immune system at sea. A threat appeared, antibodies converged, and the infection was destroyed before it could spread. Japanese submariners, expecting panic and disorder, found instead a coordinated swarm hunting them in the dark. Even the psychological impact of these unseen systems was profound. Japanese crews who had once owned the night now felt hunted. Radar detectors on their subs crackled with American pulses sweeping past. They could dive, but depth charges followed. They could surface to recharge batteries, but aircraft pounced from black skies. They could try to sprint away, but overlapping escorts closed every gap. The night ocean, once a playground of stealth, had become a maze lit by invisible beams. This erosion of confidence sapped their aggressiveness, turning hunters into fugitives. American sailors, meanwhile, gained a strange new confidence. They spoke of seeing ghosts on radar, of planes talking to ships through squawks and blips. In wardrooms, they studied silhouettes of Japanese submarines, learned evasive turns, and memorized depth charge settings. They were not fearless. Every convoy lost ships, but they were no longer blind. Where once they had crossed the Pacific dreading torpedoes from nowhere, they now crossed it with layered shields. This confidence fed discipline, and discipline fed effectiveness, tightening the coil around Japan's undersea force. All of this had grown from hard lessons earlier in the war. In 1942, when American forces first advanced beyond Midway, convoys had been makeshift, their escorts few and undertrained. Japanese submarines had sunk carriers, transports, and oilers almost at will. But as shipyards poured out new hulls and labs refined radar and sonar, a transformation occurred. By 1944, the Pacific Fleet was no longer improvising. It was executing a rehearsed, systematized defense, one impossible for Japan to mirror given its dwindling resources. Thus, the hidden advantage was not a single weapon but a philosophy, integration of technology, training, and tactics into a seamless shield. Tokyo's analysts glimpsed pieces of this puzzle but could not assemble the whole. They intercepted chatter about hunter-killer groups, read captured manuals on convoy procedure, and even salvaged radar parts from downed American planes. Yet each discovery only deepened their sense of being outpaced. While they dissected one technology, the Americans deployed two more. While they trained crews for night surface attacks, the Americans built the means to see and kill them before the attack began. By the time the pattern was clear, their submarine fleet was bleeding out in the Philippine trenches of the SEA.I in the end. This hidden advantage, radar eyes, radio nerves, sonar ears, and airborne claws, remade the ocean battlefield. It stripped Japan of its one enduring edge, the ability to strike unseen at night. It allowed slow, vulnerable convoys to move as if wrapped in armor, their lifeblood of supplies flowing to the beaches of Leyte and beyond. To the men staring from periscopes and destroyer bridges, it seemed a kind of magic. But it was no magic. It was the product of industry, innovation, and an unglamorous obsession with logistics. America had turned ships into a network, the Pacific into a chessboard, and night itself into an ally. The hidden nervous system of the American convoy was not born overnight. It was forged in laboratories, assembly lines, and shipyards, where engineers, operators, and sailors transformed raw ideas into hard steel and humming circuits. In 1944, a single escort destroyer bristled with more sensors and communications equipment than an entire Japanese destroyer squadron of 1939. Each piece of gear had a name, a model number, and a story, and together they created the invisible fortress that prowled the Pacific. Day and night, consider radar. The SC and later SG surface search sets mounted on destroyers and escort carriers were miracles of miniaturization and power. The SG, operating at a 10 centimeters wavelength, could detect a periscope head at over 4 miles and a surface submarine beyond 10. Its cathode ray screen displayed faint arcs and blips in a dim green glow, giving officers the uncanny ability to see through storms and darkness. These were not abstract advantages, but practical ones. A Japanese submarine preparing a torpedo attack at night would appear on the screen before it even lined up its shot. On the bridge, the officer of the deck could swing the ship, launch flares, and bring guns to bear with mathematical precision. Sonar, known then as ASTIC, had advanced as well. By 1944, the QGEB and later models had improved range and resolution, allowing operators to classify targets by propeller beat. Hedgehog mortars, spigot-launched projectiles that fired in a circular pattern ahead of the ship, gave escorts a weapon far more lethal than simple depth charges. Instead of guessing a sub's position, they could pummel its predicted course with contact-fused bombs. The Mark 32 depth charge and the Mark 9 projector extended the kill zone further still. This suite of detection and attack tools meant a convoy escort could sweep, detect, localize, and strike in a single coordinated maneuver. A ballet of sound and steel underwater, above deck. Antennas and masts sprouted like metallic forests. The TBS radio sets allowed instantaneous, low-power communication between ships, their signals leaping from escort to escort without betraying positions to Japanese direction finders. In the Combat Information Centers, CICs, windowless compartments glowing with plot boards and radar screens, young officers integrated every report, every echo, and every contact. This was the first true network-centric warfare. Information fused in real time, decisions made at machine speed rather than by flag signals or runners. In Japanese after-action reports, officers noted bitterly that American destroyers seemed to converge as if reading our thoughts. In reality, they were reading radar scopes and voice circuits, weaving a net no submarine could slip. Even the merchant ships were part of the machine. Liberty and Victory ships carried Navy armed guard detachments and rudimentary radar sets of their own. Their bridges were linked into the convoy network, reporting contacts and maintaining perfect station keeping. The once vulnerable freighter, lumbering and blind, had become a watchtower in its own right, a node feeding data back to escorts and carriers. This democratization of sensors and communications expanded the convoy's eyes and ears, multiplying its vigilance. Escort carriers, the CVs, derisively nicknamed combustible, vulnerable, and expendable, were, paradoxically, the convoy's crown jewels. Built on merchant hulls, they carried between 24 and 30 aircraft, Avengers fitted with ASV radar, Wildcats capable of night interceptions, and search planes with sonobuoys. Their decks were short and their armor thin, but their impact was enormous. A single CV could scout a swath of ocean 200 miles across, hurling planes into the air around the clock. These aircraft were the convoy's outstretched claws, slashing at submarines and shadowing Japanese pickets. Their pilots were trained to pounce on periscopes, strafe decks, and drop depth bombs in coordinated runs with destroyers below. The production numbers themselves tell the story of scale. By 1944, the United States had built over 100 escort carriers, more than 400 destroyer escorts, and thousands of radar and sonar sets. Motorola, RCA, and Western Electric cranked out radio equipment by the ton. Westinghouse and Raytheon refined magnetrons for centimeter-wave radar. Shipyards at Kaiser and Bethlehem launched hulls faster than paint could dry. In the time it took Japan to build one new submarine, the U.S. could commission an entire convoy screen with radar and hedgehogs on every ship. This asymmetry was not just quantitative but qualitative. Each American ship was a node in a larger system. While each Japanese ship fought largely alone, the technical leap was mirrored by training. Radar operators drilled to distinguish between sea clutter and true contacts. Sonar men memorized the acoustic signature of every known propeller. Radio discipline became a creed. No chatter, no wasted words, only crisp bearings and brevity codes. The result was a cadre of sailors who could interpret the electronic ocean as fluently as they read the real one. Their proficiency multiplied the power of the machines, turning raw data into deadly action. Japanese technology lagged fatally behind. Their submarines carried radar detectors, but few had effective counter-radar of their own. Their radios remained vulnerable to direction finding and jamming. Their doctrine assumed darkness and surprise, but American radar nullified both. Even when Japan introduced its Type 22 surface search radar, it lacked the range and clarity of the US SG sets. Their sound gear was less sensitive, their weapons less flexible. Every deficit widened at sea, where seconds meant survival. Inside Tokyo's Naval General Staff, captured equipment and interrogation reports painted a grim picture. The Americans were not just fielding better weapons. They were integrating them. Japanese planners proposed desperate countermeasures, snorkels for submarines, nocturnal dispersal of supply ships, and new torpedoes, but fuel shortages and industrial collapse made such plans academic. Against the convoy machine, they were fighting a hydra, lopping off one head while two more appeared. This technical architecture reshaped the battlefield. Convoys could operate in smaller groups, yet with greater security, reducing their visibility and shortening their exposure to ambush. Escort carriers pushed the kill zone outward, while destroyer escorts compressed it inward. The layered defense formed concentric circles of detection and firepower, overlapping like the rings of a tree. A Japanese submarine had to survive planes, sonar sweeps, hedgehogs, and depth charges just to fire a salvo, and then endure the counterattack. Few did. Even at night, when tradition told Japanese officers the enemy would be blind, the convoy's electronics hummed on. Radar pulses ticked across waves. Sonar beams pulsed through black water. Radio circuits whispered between ships. Aircraft with radar pods skimmed the horizon, their pilots peering at glowing screens instead of the stars. Darkness had become merely another dimension to exploit, not a curtain to hide behind. In the Pacific of 1944, the Americans had fused metal and signal, steel and electrons, into a single instrument of war. This was the true heart of the phenomenon that baffled Japanese soldiers watching from shore or periscope. It wasn't simply more ships or more guns. It was the invisible scaffolding of technology and training, layered until the convoys became invulnerable arteries of an advancing army. Each Liberty ship offloading ammunition on Leyte Beach was backed by 1,000 unseen decisions in laboratories, factories, and training schools. And as Japanese observers shook their heads at convoys gliding through the night under full protection, they were witnessing the future of warfare, a future in which information, coordination, and technology outmatched courage and stealth at every turn. September 21st, 1944, dawn broke in streaks of violet over the Philippine Sea. Yet the American convoy known as TG-77.4 was already moving in rigid formation. Its Liberty ships churning forward in twin columns. Two escort carriers, USS Gambier Bay and USS White Plains, trailed on the horizon, their decks humming with aircraft readied for anti-submarine patrol. Around the freighters curved a screen of destroyers and destroyer escorts, each vessel's radar sweeping the water like a metronome. Beneath them, convoys of men and supplies destined for Leyte's beaches pressed on, the living lifeblood of MacArthur's return to the Philippines. The Japanese submarine force, aware of the stakes, had marshaled everything left to strike these arteries. In Tokyo, planners named their Operation Shogo, to smash the invasion before it could root itself in Philippine soil, below the waves. Lieutenant Commander Yoshimura of the Submarine I-46 lined up his shot. He had been tracking the American convoy for 18 hours, surfacing under darkness, diving by day, and clawing for a favorable approach. In another time, 1942, perhaps, his attack would have been fatal. But the ocean of 1944 was different. Even at night, American radar planes circled like hawks, forcing I-46 to dive early and burn precious battery power. Sonar pings rolled across his hull in hypnotic pulses. Hedgehog mortars fell around him like the footsteps of some invisible giant. Now, at dawn, with the convoy in sight, he could risk one final attempt. He raised the periscope through the dripping lens. Yoshimura saw the unthinkable, merchant ships steaming under air cover, destroyers in perfect arcs, and aircraft orbiting even as the sky still held the blush of sunrise. He lined up a spread of 4 torpedoes and fired. But within seconds, a destroyer escort peeled out of formation, its bow aimed directly at his bearing. It was the USS Samuel B. Roberts, a ship half the size of a Japanese destroyer, yet bristling with radar and sonar. The Roberts had caught the faint echo of the torpedoes leaving their tubes, plotted a firing solution, and lunged forward like a predator sensing blood. Depth charges rolled off its stern. Hedgehogs launched in a ripple. Explosions tore through the water column. I-46 plunged deeper, hull groaning. Sonar pings tracked it down. Moments later, a violent detonation collapsed its compartments, and the submarine spiraled into silence. Above, the convoy barely flinched. Radio circuits flashed acknowledgments. The gap in the screen closed automatically, and the ship steamed on. Aircraft from Gambier Bay dropped sonobuoys to confirm the kill, then resumed their patrol arcs. In the Combat Information Center aboard USS White Plains, young officers plotted the blip fading from their radar screens and moved on to the next sector. It was not drama, but procedure. The convoy's immune system expelling an invader before it reached the heart. This scene repeated across the Pacific. On October 5, 1944, off Palawan, another Japanese submarine, I-169, attempted to infiltrate a convoy heading toward Mindoro. American Avenger aircraft from an escort carrier detected its periscope wake at dawn. Before the submarine could submerge fully, destroyer escorts converged from opposite bearings, laying overlapping depth charge patterns. Survivors later described the sea boiling around them, depth charges detonating in curtains rather than clusters. The convoy never slowed. Supplies arrived on schedule. Even when Japanese attacks succeeded, the convoy system absorbed the blow. On November 24, 1944, off Leyte Gulf, torpedoes from Submarine I-56 struck a tanker at the edge of a formation. Within minutes, 2 destroyer escorts dropped smoke screens, others deployed rescue boats, and aircraft swept outward to hunt the attacker. The wounded tanker burned but did not sink, and replacement ships filled the supply gap within days. This resilience shattered the psychological effect Japan had once counted on, the panic of an unprotected convoy. Instead, American formations moved like clockwork, their discipline unbroken, their losses immediately compensated. The Battle of Leyte's supply lines became the decisive test of the convoy system. Japan's fleet, shattered at Surigao Strait and the Sibuyan Sea, still hoped to strangle the invasion through submarines and air attacks. But the convoys kept coming, a gray tide of oilers, transports, and freighters escorted by a mechanized phalanx. Each day, aircraft flew 1,500 anti-submarine sorties from escort carriers. Each night, destroyer escorts swept designated lanes with sonar and depth charges. Japanese submarines, already low on fuel, could barely approach before detection. Many turned back without firing. From the beachheads at Leyte, American soldiers watched the horizon speckled with ships and marveled at the constant flow. Fresh artillery shells arrived even as the previous day's bombardment smoked. Tanks rolled off landing ships with full fuel tanks. Hospitals expanded with new plasma and equipment. The invasion did not pause to wait for supply. The supply was already waiting. Behind every inch of ground taken, a convoy had risked the submarine-infested sea, and behind every convoy stood the invisible shield of radar, aircraft, and disciplined escorts. Japanese officers on shore, by contrast, stared in disbelief. They had been promised the Americans would run dry, their attack stalling for lack of fuel and munitions. Instead, the opposite unfolded. The American advance accelerated, each fresh convoy feeding the assault like oxygen to a fire. Prisoners later recalled the confusion. How could the enemy deliver supplies under constant threat, by night as well as day, as though the ocean itself were theirs? The reports reaching Tokyo were grim. Submarine commanders wrote of radar pulses echoing across the waves, of aircraft with uncanny timing, and of depth charges falling with mathematical precision. Losses mounted. By December 1944, Japan had lost more than half its active submarine force in the Philippine theater. Each sinking left a gap no new construction could fill. The Navy's doctrine, crafted for fleet battles, had no answer for convoys that functioned as self-defending ecosystems. The first major battle example thus revealed the deeper truth. The convoy system was not simply an adjunct to war, but a weapon in its own right. It consumed enemy submarines, absorbed air raids, and projected power across oceans with the inevitability of a tide. By protecting its lifelines, America made its offensives unassailable. In every engagement, Japanese soldiers and sailors confronted not just American ships, but an entire industrial and technological philosophy, one that valued coordination over heroics, information over guesswork, and endurance over ambush. On the bridge of USS Samuel B. Roberts after the kill of I-46, the captain radioed back a simple code word acknowledging the attack's failure. Then, with engines steady, the destroyer Escort swung back into formation. Ahead, the Liberty ships plowed on, decks stacked with ammunition crates, vehicles lashed down under tarps. Overhead, Avengers droned in holding patterns, their radar scanning for the next blip. The convoy was still whole, still moving, still feeding the war. It would be like this, day after day, until the Philippines was secure. That was the first major battle demonstration of the hidden advantage. The Pacific had become an arena where convoys were not prey but predators, where Japan's stealth weapons vanished under overlapping shields of steel, radio, and radar. And as Japanese officers looked on, unable to stop the flow, they realized that something far more powerful than numbers was at work, a system that had turned the very act of resupply into a weapon of war. The strategic and psychological consequences of America's night-proof convoys unfolded slowly but inexorably, like the tightening of a noose. By late 1944, Japan's admirals had begun to understand that the war in the Pacific was no longer about decisive battles or sudden strikes. It was about sustaining momentum across thousands of miles, about feeding men and machines on beaches that only weeks before had been enemy territory. Every convoy that reached Leyte or Mindoro without significant loss was a defeat for Japan's entire maritime strategy. Every freighter that survived torpedoes and bombers carried not only supplies but also the message that stealth no longer ruled the ocean. At a strategic level, the convoys turned invasion into occupation with seamless speed. When MacArthur promised, "I shall return," his words would have been hollow without the arteries to make them real. American planners could land entire divisions, tanks, and airfields knowing that fuel, food, and ammunition would keep arriving under the convoy's protective umbrella. This logistical certainty allowed operations to overlap and accelerate. While one island was being secured, another was already under assault, backed by convoys moving like armored conveyor belts. Japan could not predict, let alone intercept, this constant flow. Its fleet had been built to fight an enemy approaching slowly, not an enemy arriving in endless waves, supplied as fast as ships could steam. Psychologically, the impact was even deeper. Japanese submariners who had once prided themselves on night attacks found themselves hunted relentlessly. Their sonar detectors registered the steady heartbeat of American radar pulses. Their periscopes glimpsed destroyers weaving in flawless arcs. Aircraft appeared at times and places that seemed impossible, plunging the deep ocean into a state of siege. This steady erosion of initiative bred fatalism. Reports from captured crewmen spoke of the steel fence around American convoys and the eyes in the sky that left no escape. By 1945, many submarine captains approached their patrol areas not with anticipation but with dread. Onshore, Japanese soldiers experienced a different kind of shock. They had been told the American offensive would overextend itself, that supply lines would falter under submarine attack and airstrikes. Instead, they watched as the beaches filled with crates, tanks rolled inland bristling with fuel cans, and field hospitals expanded with fresh equipment. Even after devastating kamikaze attacks, new convoys appeared on the horizon, unbroken, steaming under escort as though nothing had happened. The conviction that the enemy could be starved of resources evaporated. Morale sagged. Hunger and ammunition shortages on Japanese-held islands contrasted sharply with the abundance pouring from American ships just offshore. For American sailors and soldiers, the effect was reversed. The convoy system created an aura of invincibility. Knowing that radar screens watched the dark and planes circled overhead, crews performed their tasks with disciplined confidence. Merchant mariners no longer dreaded the sunset. Many welcomed it, believing the night now favored them rather than the enemy. This sense of security did not eliminate loss or fear. Ships were still sunk, men still died, but it transformed the emotional terrain of the war. Courage became routine rather than desperate, a product of systems and training rather than sheer luck. Strategically, the convoy system also freed the U.S. Navy to use its fleet carriers and fast battleships offensively rather than as protective screens. With escort carriers and destroyer escorts handling the lifelines, the striking forces could roam farther afield, hitting Japanese bases and shipping lanes with impunity. This bifurcation of roles mirrored a larger American advantage: specialization at scale. Japan had to use its remaining fleet for everything: escort, bombardment, interception, spreading its power thin. The U.S. could afford to build entire classes of ships dedicated solely to protecting the flow of supplies and still have more than enough to wage offensive operations. The psychological toll on Japanese commanders extended beyond fear into doctrinal crisis. They had built a navy to fight a mirror image of themselves, another fleet seeking decisive battle. But the Americans had shifted the frame, making logistics itself the arena of conflict. Destroying enemy ships no longer crippled the offensive, it merely inconvenienced it. The idea that war could be won by annihilating a single enemy fleet dissolved in the face of convoys that regenerated and reinforced without pause. Japan's admirals were forced to watch a strategy they could neither counter nor copy, shackled by shortages of fuel, steel, and trained crews. Within the convoys, discipline and technology blended into a new form of warfare. Combat information centers processed blips and bearings in real time. Planes vectored by radar swooped on contacts hundreds of miles away. Destroyer escorts launched hedgehog patterns with mathematical precision. This relentless integration created what later theorists would call networked warfare, the ability to sense, decide, and act faster than an opponent. For the first time at sea, speed of information outweighed speed of movement, and darkness no longer slowed the flow. The psychological contrast between the two sides became starkest at night. For Japanese crews, night had been an ally since the Russo-Japanese War. Now it was a killing ground. Depth charges fell with uncanny accuracy. Aircraft engines roared from unseen skies. Every dark wave could conceal a patrol plane or a sonar sweep. American crews, by contrast, began to treat the night as a cloak for their own movements, confident their instruments would detect any intruder. This inversion of expectation eroded one of Japan's most cherished advantages and gave the Americans a new rhythm of operations unconstrained by the WWII 1945. Even kamikaze tactics could not sever the lifelines. Suicide planes might strike a carrier or a destroyer escort, but the convoys continued, their gaps filled by reinforcements steaming from distant shipyards. The convoy's strategic effect thus extended beyond simple protection. They allowed the U.S. to plan offensives with a certainty of sustainment that no military in history had ever possessed. With supplies guaranteed, amphibious assaults could leapfrog ever closer to Japan, and airfields built on captured islands could be stocked and fueled without delay. This accelerating tempo compressed Japan's defensive options until surrender became inevitable. In retrospect, the convoys were as decisive as any battle. They eroded Japan's capacity to strike, broke the morale of its submariners, and undermined the entire strategy of attrition at sea. They also revealed a larger truth about modern war, that technology and coordination could invert the balance of power even without superior firepower on each individual ship. The convoy system was not glamorous, but it was inexorable, a machine that translated American industry into battlefield endurance on the horizon at Leyte. As yet another convoy slid into anchorage under the guns of its escorts, Japanese lookouts must have felt a creeping sense of inevitability. This was not a battle they could win with courage or surprise. It was a process, a tide, a system. And against a system, individual heroics drowned like sparks in the ocean. When the guns finally fell silent in August 1945, the great convoys that had crept across the Pacific left behind more than a logistical footprint. They left a blueprint for modern warfare. The Japanese Navy, once the terror of night seas, lay at the bottom of straits it had ruled for decades. The American system of 24-hour protection had not only delivered armies to beaches, but had delivered the future of military operations, integrated, networked, and unbroken by darkness. As U.S. ships anchored in Tokyo Bay, their radar dishes still rotated, their combat information centers still alive with whispered bearings, as if the war's rhythm could not be switched off. The lesson was already echoing beyond the Pacific. Connection, coordination, and sustained supply had defeated speed, armor, and surprised in Washington. Planners and admirals studied the convoy's record with forensic precision. Every successful landing owed its life to those escorted arteries, and every new doctrine for the post-war Navy carried that imprint. Destroyer escorts, escort carriers, and merchant ships fitted with Navy gun crews became permanent features of Cold War thinking. NATO convoys across the Atlantic would later rehearse similar protective screens, radar networks, and air cover. fearing Soviet submarines the way their predecessors had feared the Imperial Navy. The psychological barrier that convoys had shattered, the tyranny of night, would never fully return. Even the Soviet Union, watching from afar, understood that logistics wrapped in an electronic shield could shift global power without a single decisive fleet action. For Japan's surviving officers, the post-war reckoning was painful and instructive. Interrogations at Sugamo prison and Allied intelligence summaries recorded their astonishment at how quickly the Americans had built a system of convoy protection that erased traditional naval advantages. Former captains described the ghost chain of American escorts, ships that seemed to appear from nowhere, using radar and radio-like telepathy. In memoirs and testimony, Japanese naval strategists admitted they had underestimated the American capacity for coordination. They had built a navy for duels. America had built a navy for throughput, protection, and persistence. The convoys had not simply resisted attack. They had turned supply into a weapon. The influence radiated beyond the oceans. Air forces adapted the same principles to aerial refueling and bomber streams. Armies rewrote their field manuals to reflect the necessity of uninterrupted resupply under constant surveillance. By the time of the Korean War, the U.S. Navy deployed hunter-killer groups modeled directly on the Pacific convoys, using radar and sonar to sweep sea lanes clean before troops ever boarded transports. In Vietnam, Persian Gulf operations, and later conflicts, convoys under electronic watch became routine. What had seemed miraculous in 1944, aircraft flying night cover, ships weaving sonar fences, coded bursts of radio knitting a fleet together, became the baseline expectation of American military-powered in the 1991 Gulf War. The ghosts of Leyte and Okinawa reappeared in digital form. GPS, satellite communications, and AWACS aircraft created a 24-hour battlefield where darkness offered no refuge. Marine supply columns rolled through deserts with sensors scanning in all directions, protected by air patrols and quick reaction forces. Network-centric warfare, a term coined decades later, traced its DNA back to those lumbering Liberty ships guarded by destroyers under Pacific moons. The principle was the same. Deny the enemy the chance to disrupt the flow, and the force at the front can operate without pause. For veterans of the Pacific convoys, the legacy was more personal. Many returned home to a public that never saw their part of the war as glamorous. Yet within naval circles they were recognized as the steel backbone of victory. Merchant sailors who had stood watch at midnight under flickering radar screens knew they had been part of something unprecedented. Their experience became textbooks at naval academies, their logs and after-action reports mined for lessons about coordination under stress. The convoys had demanded courage not in sudden bursts but in endless vigilance, a harder, quieter heroism that modern military professionals still study. The Japanese, too, absorbed the lesson. In the post-war Maritime Self-Defense Force, officers trained with U.S. counterparts in anti-submarine tactics and convoy protection, building a navy designed to protect sea lanes rather than to hunt fleets. Radar pickets, escort destroyers, and maritime patrol aircraft became their bread and butter. Ironically, the descendants of the Navy that once prowled Pacific nights became specialists in the very doctrine that had undone them at its heart. The convoy's legacy was about time. They bought time for invasions to succeed, time for industry to reach the front, and time for strategy to unfold without disruption. In doing so, they also shrank time for the enemy, compressing options until defeat became inevitable. This asymmetry of time, enabled by technology, organization, and relentless escort, redefined how great powers waged war. Firepower could be matched, speed could be equaled, but the ability to sustain operations day and night, over oceans and continents, became the true measure of dominance. And so, as historians trace the arc from the Pacific of 1944 to the conflicts of the 21st century, the image endures: columns of merchant ships gliding through dark seas under radar domes and circling aircraft, their wakes illuminated by moonlight and phosphorescence, their escorts forming a living wall. Japanese soldiers who once waited on island outposts for the Americans to falter saw, instead, an inexhaustible procession, a logistical tide that could not be turned back. From that tide rose a doctrine, And from that doctrine, a new world order of military power, in which supply was not weakness but the ultimate strength. The closing lesson is stark, and it carries beyond the Pacific and beyond its time. Wars are not only won in battles, but in the spaces between them, on the roads, the sea lanes, and the air corridors where lifeblood flows. In the Second World War, the United States learned to make those spaces invulnerable, turning its convoys into fortresses without walls, guardians of an empire of movement. For Japan, disbelief turned to despair, then to surrender. For the world, a new reality dawned. In modern war, connection outweighs firepower and endurance eclipses surprise. Darkness offers no sanctuary. The convoy sails on,